common sort of lay people, non-scientists on scientific expeditions and discover new species with them. Those are called taxon expeditions. And what I'd like to do in this talk, which is it's a talk aimed at a general audience. I usually give it for sort of a general audience of people who normally would read my book. So it's not really an academic talk, but I hope it still has enough meat for the academic listeners to be interesting. And it's all about the evolution of animals and plants that are adapting to the conditions that we are creating in our urban environment. And surprisingly, perhaps we start outside of the urban environment. We start inside an ant's nest. This is the inside of an ant's nest, and in a lab, actually, in a lab setting. And you see a couple of worker ants, but you also see at the bottom of the screen a beetle. And what's happening there at the bottom left corner is that this beetle, which has evolved to speak ant in a chemical way, is chemically telling this worker ant, "Hey, I'm also a worker ant, and I'm hungry. Please feed me." And the worker ant complies because it doesn't know any better than that this beetle indeed is also a worker ant. And that's because this beetle is just one of thousands of species of so-called myrmecophiles. Myrmecophiles are animals, usually small invertebrate animals, that have evolved the ability to live inside an ant's nest. There are literally thousands of species. These are a couple of the beetle species that you can find inside ants' nests, usually in a specific, the nest of a specific species of ant. But besides beetles, there is also mites, there are caterpillars, there are millipedes, spiders, snails. There's a whole menagerie of species that find a niche inside an ant's nest. And sometimes they prey on the ants, sometimes they prey on the larvae or on the eggs. Sometimes they just live from refuse of the ants. But in all cases, they're extremely specialized, and they spend their entire life cycle inside the ant's nest and live nowhere else on Earth. And the reason that there are so many of these species of myrmecophiles is that ants, but also other organisms like termites, are so-called ecosystem engineers. If you look at a large ant nest, and this is the nest of a South American leafcutter ant, or actually it's a deserted nest that has been filled with cement by researchers and is now being excavated, I think, as to create a museum exhibit. You can see how large and complex such a large ant colony is, where probably hundreds of millions of ant individuals live together with all kinds of divisions of labor. But when you think about it, to keep this ant city running, the ant nest itself is actually much larger, or at least its influence is much larger. And it's felt in the hinterland of this ant colony, because the ants need to harvest food and all kinds of resources to keep that colony running. So it's a bit like a city that where hundreds of thousands or millions of people live together, and to keep that city running, resources have to be brought in from the much larger environment. So in doing this, the ants and also other colony building animals like termites create opportunities for other species. They create niches within their nest and its surroundings for other species to make use of that concentration of energy that the ants produce inside their nest. And now for millions of years, of course, ants and also termites were the world's major ecosystem engineers. But in the past few thousands of years, we have taken over from them. We have become the world's greatest ecosystem engineers, because we do exactly the same thing that ants and termites do. We build cities, we build colonies, if you like, and to keep those colonies functioning and running, we concentrate resources and food and other and energy in those cities, which we harvest elsewhere outside of the city. So like ant nests, cities also provide opportunities for, so human cities also provide opportunities for other animals. And cities are a habitat that maybe in the past was sort of um, a rarity, but in the past few decades, and probably in the coming few decades as well, cities are going to become a major habitat type on Earth. If you look at this animation, you can see how multi-million inhabitant cities have grown over the past few decades and probably will continue to grow in the decades to come. So it's no longer an exception of land use. It's going to be the norm in many parts of the world. If you look at that area in eastern China, you see that there are huge concentrations of cities. There's, for example, the Pearl River Delta, which is one of those blue blobs, is an area about the size of Belgium, which is completely urbanized. 120 million people live there together, which is almost as many as in the whole of Russia. So urbanized landscapes are going to be one of the major habitat types, one of the major land use types on Earth, and also one of the major novel ecosystems that animals and plants will encounter. So it's likely that they will interact with cities in one way or another. And cities are not just dangerous for animals and plants. They create opportunities that don't exist outside of cities. And I'm not just talking about birds which find novel opportunities for nesting, like this coot in the Rotterdam Canal, which has found an upturned shopping trolley to build its nest in. And I'm also not really talking about these novel food sources that some urban mammals can harvest, like this fox in London. But you do have to realize that because of our human presence, there are lots of novel opportunities for animals. And if you're thinking about mammals, especially, of course, mammals that, like us, use their forelegs to manipulate things. You could, in the tropics, for example, monkeys are ideally suited to find a new niche inside cities, because cities are made for people, for primates which use their hands. And of course, monkeys also use their hands to manipulate things. So we've created an environment that's perfectly suitable for them. But in the US, you can also think of raccoons, for example, who also use their forepaws to manipulate things, like this raccoon is doing. I have to warn you that it seems that all the videos in my presentation, the sound runs a little bit faster, I think, than the picture. So there's like a little 1 second gap there, but I hope it's still clear what's happening, especially in this case. And another example is this one. It's not just about food, it's also about other opportunities. This is a woodpecker that normally would use like a wooden hollow tree or a piece of loose bark to amplify its drum roll to defend its territory. But this woodpecker has discovered that the acoustic properties of a man-made object, namely a lamppost, are much better than that of an old-fashioned hollow tree. And it possibly can defend a larger or better territory simply because of this discovery that it can amplify its sound by making use of these lampposts. And in fact, I gave this talk not too long ago in the Botanic Garden here in Amsterdam. And the people there told me that they have this tropical greenhouse, and every day there's a great spotted woodpecker that's drumming on the roof of the greenhouse, which even amplifies it even more, and it probably can maintain a better quality territory because of that invention. Not just animals, plants also can benefit from the way we manipulate the environment. This is Danish scurvy grass, which is a common plant that you can find along the highways in Western Europe. In June, you see all these little white flowers along the highways. But if you would have looked at a distribution map of this plant species in the middle of the 19th century, you would only have seen the coastlines, because this is it's a beach plant. It grows on salty soil. But because in Northern Europe we put salt on the roads to de-ice them in winter, the whole year round there's like um, a briny strip of about a meter wide along all the major highways, which has allowed these plants to expand their distribution area. And if you now look at the distribution map of these species, you still see the coastlines, but you also see the entire highway network of northwestern Europe. So thanks to us, this plant has been able to expand its distribution area tremendously. So there are advantages, there are opportunities for wild animals and plants in cities, but there are also dangers. There are also challenges. This little video shows what initially may seem like moths in light beams, but these are actually birds. They are thousands of warblers that migrate in September along the eastern seaboard of the US, and are then funneled by the southern tip of Manhattan, where they meet on the 11th of September, the Tribute in Light, which is a memorial for the victims of the September 11 attacks. But it's like two giant towers made of light, enormous light beams that shine straight up into the air. And the migrating birds, which often migrate at night, are caught by this, or trapped by this cage of light. And it's very ironic to see that a memorial which was set up to commemorate human deaths is now causing bird deaths. And so light pollution, of course, in general, is a major challenge for birds and insects, and probably also other organisms in cities. And that's just one of the many challenges that this urban environment poses to animals and plants. So in a way, you could say cities are extreme environments. They are just like hot springs or deserts. There are places where there is food, there are ecological opportunities for species, but there are very severe requirements to those species to adapt to be able to make use of those opportunities. And what exactly are those special conditions that cities pose? Well, you can probably organize them in four separate categories. And the first one is simply the physics of the city, the physical aspects of the city, which are different in many ways from natural environments. For example, temperature. We have the urban heat island, the presence and activities of millions of people generate a lot of heat. The heat remains trapped between the buildings, which block the wind. And also the buildings themselves are made of materials that heat up very easily and then radiate out their heat at night. So you can have a bubble of hot air in a city that in a large city can be 8, 9, sometimes even 10 degrees centigrade higher than at the same time in the surrounding countryside. And it's not just hot air, it's also humid air, because humans and their machines produce a lot of water vapor, which is released. So you get a bubble of hot, humid air that in summer can start rising up, and then above the city meets cooler layers of the atmosphere, and then the water vapor can start condensing as clouds. So some cities are so large that they generate their own climate, and you get a phenomenon called urban rain. And you see this happening in this collection of satellite images made above the city of Houston. You cannot really see the city itself, but it's in the middle of the screen. And over the course of the day, you can see the time of the day at the bottom left. You can see that clouds are forming over the city center, which eventually coalesce into rain clouds and produce precipitation over the city center, which is not present outside of the city. And then there's noise, of course. We produce a lot of noise in the city. There's constantly this blanket of low frequency sound, and a lot of animals use sound to communicate with each other, insects, amphibians, birds, mammals, and this noise will interfere with their communication. So it's something, it's a physical aspect of the city that animals will need to deal with. And finally, there's the fact that we tend to clothe our city in impervious surfaces. So brick and concrete and glass and steel, and these are all surfaces that don't form soils and that vegetation cannot root in very easily. And as a result, vegetation is usually very sparse in the inner city, with the result that you get the next category of physical of features of the city, namely that green habitats are very fragmented. This is a map of the green areas in the city center of London. And you see that there are some large parks and there are some smaller parks, but it's really an archipelago of green islands. And if you zoom in at any spatial scale, you will keep seeing this fragmentation. Even at the scale of meters, vegetation tends to be very patchy. The third category is pollution. Whether we like it or not, and whether we try to prevent it or not, human activities produce some sort of pollution, and if you have a lot of people together and a lot of activities together, this level of pollution reaches higher levels than you would expect in areas where humans are sparser. And then I don't just mean chemical pollution or plastic pollution, but also radiation pollution, electromagnetic radiation, light pollution, are all forms of pollution that you find in cities which are absent elsewhere. And the fourth category, and I think this is actually the most important category of urban conditions, is the fact that we sort of unwittingly produce new food webs in the city. This is a picture that was taken in the streets of London. You could also have taken it in Germany or the Netherlands or Belgium, of a ringneck parakeet from India, which is feeding on a horse chestnut from Asia Minor, and on the leaves of the horse chestnut you see the markings of a leaf mining caterpillar from Macedonia. So a little 3-species food web of species that none of which are native to London, which are interacting with each other in a way that has been made possible by us. So you have new ecological interactions being formed among species that are released either accidentally or on purpose by humans in cities. So the urban ecosystem is like a mixture of native species and introduced species which start interacting with each other, and that produces new requirements for these species to adapt to one another. So what I've just sketched actually is like an evolutionary landscape. We have a novel habitat, a novel environment, an urban environment where human activities are the predominant force, with opportunities but also challenges. And most species that colonize urban environments will potentially start evolving, start adapting to those opportunities and challenges. And this is just a little thought experiment of how that would look. And I'd like to introduce that with this museum specimen. This is the McFlurry hedgehog, which is a museum specimen from a very nice exhibit in the Natural History Museum of Rotterdam, where they have a beautiful display called Dead Animal Tales. And these are all animals that have been taxidermied in exactly the same position in which they were found, and that usually involved a fatal interaction with us, with humans. So the McFlurry hedgehog is one of the exhibits in that display, and it's a hedgehog that was found dead with its head stuck in a McFlurry soft serve ice cream cup, because these cups have, of course, a lid with a hole in it, and the hedgehogs find discarded cups which still have a little bit of ice cream inside. They try to get to the ice cream, but because they have these spines in their neck which point backwards, they can get their head in, but they cannot get their head out anymore. So a lot of hedgehogs are actually dying because they get their head stuck in these cups, and either they starve or they drown because they fall into the water, or they walk into the traffic and get killed. By the way, it's not just McDonald's ice cream cups. If you look on YouTube, you find many movies of hedgehogs with a similar type of cup on their head. This is a different brand of a hedgehog that was fortunately rescued by a passerby.
Aww.
So this one survived and even got a little bit of ice cream to feed on. But you could imagine that a lot of them, of course, don't survive. So there we have a selection pressure. We have a potential evolutionary force. Imagine, this is just a thought experiment, that you have all these ice cream cups lying around, so novel food source for hedgehogs. Which they could make use of if they didn't have those spines, which causes them to die whenever they use this food source. Now you could also imagine that the spines actually may not be needed in the urban environment. Possibly the predators that these spines defend against are not present in the urban environment. So a mutant hedgehog without any spines could possibly be at an advantage because it doesn't have any ill effect from the loss of spines, and at the same time it allows it to make use of this novel food source, namely soft serve ice cream left behind in cups. And if this were the case, then of course, if this is heritable, then the offspring of this hedgehog would benefit in the same way. And you could imagine that because these spineless hedgehogs survive and reproduce better than the original hedgehogs, over time, over many generations, the hedgehog population in a city could evolve into a spineless hedgehog. I'm not saying this is happening, it probably isn't happening, but I'm just using this as an example of how you could imagine this process of urban evolution to take place. There is, in fact, one case of a spineless hedgehog in an urban environment. This is Nelson. Nelson is an adult hedgehog that was discovered in a backyard in London, without any spines. And Nelson conceivably could be the start of such an evolutionary process. And if that would take place, then we would talk of human-induced rapid evolutionary change, or HIREC. And HIREC is just another word for what I call urban evolution. Oh, and by the way, if you're wondering what Nelson looks like if he rolls himself up into a ball like hedgehogs do in defense, then it looks like this, which is pretty weird. So again, it's a hypothetical example, but I'm now going to give you a number of probably real examples of urban evolution. And we start again with that first category of urban conditions, namely the physics of the city, and particularly those hard surfaces that you find in cities much more than elsewhere. Now, one species that has adapted to these surfaces is Anolis cristatellus. This is a lizard from the Caribbean. It lives on the island of Puerto Rico, and its natural niche is to live in the forest, to run along sort of medium-sized branches, chasing insects. That's its original niche. That's what it's completely adapted to. That's what it's good at. But since cities have appeared on Puerto Rico, these lizards have invaded cities, and there they try to do exactly the same thing that they do in forests. They try to run around chasing insects. But of course, the surfaces that they run on in cities are very different from the surfaces in forests. They are smoother and they are flatter usually. There in cities it has to run around walls and windows and ledges of roofs and rain pipes, very different surfaces. So you could imagine that its feet are not perfectly adapted to those novel, smoother surfaces. And somebody who's been, or hang on, yeah, I just want to show you a little video here of a lizard that has problems, an Anolis cristatellus that has problems moving around this urban environment. Here is one that's trying to jump from a rain pipe to the edge of a roof, and it doesn't cling on properly, and it falls. And these are fairly large lizards, so when they fall, they could break something, or they could even die. So that's your selection pressure. That's the natural selection that could cause the feet of these lizards to evolve to adapt to these urban surfaces. And somebody who's been studying this is Kristen Winchell. At the time when she was doing this, still a PhD student. She's now a postdoc, and she did a very nice study where she caught lizards with this little modified fishing rod alive in 3 different Puerto Rican cities, and also in 3 forests outside of those 3 cities. So in six different places, she took samples of living lizards, and she subjected those lizards to various measurements. She took x-rays of them to measure the lengths of their bones. She put their feet on flatbed scanners to measure the number of lamellae under their toes. And she also took eggs of urban and non-urban lizards to her lab to see whether any differences were reproduced in the lab when those eggs hatched and the lizards grew up under the exact same conditions. And they did. And what she found is summarized in this little diagram. So you see dark boxes and light boxes, and the dark boxes are the measurements from the urban environment, and the light boxes are from the natural environment, from the forests. And in every panel, you see six boxes. So those are the 3 cities with the 3 forests outside of those cities. And on the left-hand side, you see the measurements for the rear legs, for the hind legs, and on the right-hand side, you see the measurements for the front legs. At the top, you see the measurements for the lengths of the bones, and here at the bottom, you see the measurements for the numbers of lamellae. So basically, what you should notice is that the measurements from the urban environment tend to be higher than the measurements from the forest environment, which means that in the cities, the lizards tend to have longer limbs, and they tend to have more lamellae under their feet. And you could imagine that indeed that is the result of adaptation to this urban environment. So where surfaces are smoother and flatter. So perhaps with having longer limbs and more lamellae under your feet, you can balance yourself better on the surfaces. But she's also done a number of experiments where she has built a ramp, an experimental ramp, made of an urban surface, so tiles, very smooth glazed tiles, which are under an angle, so they're under a 45-degree angle. You can't really see that because they're filmed from above, but she chases urban lizards and forest lizards up this ramp and just measures how well and how quick they are at scaling this ramp. And here you see an urban lizard running up this urban ramp, and as you can see, it has no problems at all with that, runs over it smoothly. But if you take a forest lizard, then you can often see that it clearly has more trouble moving onto this incline. It slides back and it has to pause now and then. So indeed, she also has data which show that indeed these forest lizards are not as good as at moving around these urban environments as the city lizards are. So that's probably a good example of real urban evolution. Now, the second category is fragmentation. And of course, we associate an archipelago like this immediately with evolution, because it reminds us of archipelagos like the Galapagos or like Hawaii, which are full of textbook examples of evolution, of animals evolving in different direction on different islands. And you could imagine that the same goes on in these different islands of green in an urban environment. And one place where you could expect this to happen is Manhattan. Now, this is a bit of a strange picture of Manhattan because it comes from a very nice project called the Manhattan Project, which is an initiative which took place about 11 years ago, where it was attempted to recreate the environment that Manhattan had 400 years ago when it was first discovered by Europeans. So on the left, you see the way Manhattan probably looked back then, and on the right, you see how it looks now. So it's also a very good visual way of showing what an enormous ecological change urbanization causes. This project, by the way, also has a very nice website, Wilikia website, where you have like a sort of Google Earth interface where you can zoom into Manhattan of 400 years ago and let the today's street plan appears, so you can see how the environment has changed. And you can also select a certain block of the city, for example, the block where you live, if you live in Manhattan, and let the program calculate what was the most likely flora and fauna that you would have found in that part of the city back 400 years ago. So you get a list of species of plants and animals, and one species that is often very high up on the list is the white-footed mouse. Now, the white-footed mouse is this cute animal. It's a native rodent of the eastern coast of North America. And a colleague of mine, Jason Munshi South at Fordham University in New York, studies these mice in the city parks in New York where they still survive. And he's studying whether they are evolving in different directions in different parks. And he has a very nice little TED Ed lecture, of which I'd like to show a short clip.
And this guy we catch in almost every forested area in New York City. This is the white-footed mouse. This is not the mouse you find running around your apartment. This is a native species, been here long before humans, and you find them in forests and meadows. Because they're so common in forest areas in the city, we're using them as a model to understand how species are adapting to urban environments. So if you think back 400 years ago, the 5 boroughs would have been covered in forest and other types of vegetation. This mouse would have been everywhere. Huge populations that showed few genetic differences across the landscape. But if you look at the situation today, they're just stuck in these little islands of forest scattered around the city. Just using 18 short segments of DNA, we can pretty much take a mouse, somebody could give us a mouse, not tell us where it was from, and we could determine what park it came from. That's how different they become.
So what Jason is saying here is that those 400 years indeed have been enough for measurable differences in the DNA in those isolated mouse populations to have evolved. But since this video was made, he's done more research also into the genomics of these populations, and he's been able to show that those differences in different parks are not random differences. They mean something. They have to do with the special conditions in the parks. For example, in Central Park, he's found certain mutations in genes that allow these mice to deal with a very fatty diet. Of course, Central Park is the most heavily visited park in North America, and people leave junk food there, and pizza crusts and French fries and peanuts, and the mice eat this. And of course, to them it's just as unhealthy as it is to us. But they've had 400 mouse generations to adapt to that type of food, and we haven't. So it's a very nice example of how you see island evolution in different parks in New York City in a wild urban animal. Now, pollution, of course, is also a major selection force, a major evolutionary force. And in my book, I give some examples of animals adapting to chemical pollution. But here I'd like to talk about light pollution. So light pollution is I think, a very major force of evolution in urban environments. What you see here are the tracings of insects that are attracted by the light and that are circling lights. And of course, for millions of years, the only light at night was the moon and the stars. And nocturnal animals, like insects, would have used the moon as a beacon to navigate. If as an insect you want to fly in a straight line at night, and there's a moon, you just need to keep a fixed angle with the moon, and then you fly nicely in a straight line. But suddenly, if that moon is not a moon but a street lantern, which is much closer, and therefore if you keep a fixed angle with that street lantern, you don't fly in a straight line, you fly in ever decreasing circles around that street light. And that's probably what you see happening here, at least for some of those insects. Either way, it's artificial light at night is probably bad news for most nocturnal animals. Insects, they sit close to the light. They can die because of the heat, or they can burn themselves from the heat of the lamp. And even if they're not physically harmed, then they sit near the light and they're wasting time, which they should have spent looking for food or looking for mates. So probably artificial light at night is a major negative effect, which you could expect species to adapt to, at least to start adapting to. And surprisingly, this has not really been studied until a few years ago when Florian Altermat published this study of a single species of insect, a small ermine moth, in Switzerland. And what he did is these moths, they make these large nests of caterpillars in rosaceous shrubs. So you can easily collect them by the thousands, and that's what he did. He collected thousands of these caterpillars in the city center of Zurich, where there's a lot of artificial light at night, but also of the same species of caterpillar outside of the city in the countryside where it's dark at night. And he then hatched those caterpillars into moths, and he marked every moth with a little paint mark to make sure that he could tell whether they were from urban caterpillars or from rural caterpillars, and then released all of those moths in one go in a single cage, which had a single light source at the end, and counted how many of the individuals sat close to the light source. And it turned out that those dark sky moths, so the moths from the rural environment, still had a stronger tendency to be attracted to the light than the urban moths. The difference seems to be, for some reason, stronger in males than in females, but in both cases you do seem to see the effect of what may have been long adaptation, or at least for the past few hundred moth generations, adaptation in those urban populations to which has resulted in an avoidance, or at least a stronger avoidance of artificial light at night than in those rural moths. And if this is, this hasn't really been repeated as far as I know, but it's probably, if it's true, then it's probably something that goes on in many more species of insect. Now, finally, this final group of aspects of the city, namely new ecological relationships, as I said, I think that is actually the most important, the strongest evolutionary force in city environments. We have these completely new food webs which are constantly changing because species are being brought in by us all the time. So these new food webs of species that are interacting with each other in ecological ways, they start using each other as food sources or competing with each other for the same food sources or the same nesting opportunities, etc. But what we sometimes forget in these urban food webs is that one major node in that network is us. We are also an urban species. Humans are also an urban species, and we provide food very directly to a number of larger animals like birds and mammals. And what we're seeing in cities is that especially birds and mammals are taking food directly from us. And this picture of a lady feeding city pigeons is actually not that different from that movie I showed at the beginning of ants feeding a beetle. This is exactly the same situation. It's one species sharing its food with another species because that other species somehow manages to hijack the social communication system, which allows that species to share its food with that other species. And pigeons are doing exactly the same thing as those myrmecophile beetles. But what we tend to see, especially with birds and mammals in cities, is that the direct interaction of them with us is changing personalities. And there seems to be some evolution going on there as well. Not very detailed aspects of the personality, but sort of the broad scale categories in which personalities can be divided. And two major aspects are neophilia and problem-solving abilities. Now, to start with neophilia, or actually I should say neophobia. This is the tendency of wild animals to be afraid to avoid novel objects in their environment. If you have a stable environment, something new is more likely to be bad news than good news. So you can understand that wild animals tend to be very hesitant to approach novel things in their environment. But in urban environments, the situation is reversed. People are producing novel food sources all the time. So if you're an urban animal depending for its food on humans, it might actually be good to be neophilic rather than neophobic. It might be good to be curious about new objects because it might be some new kind of food that people have produced that has benefits. So this has been studied a number of times, the impact of urbanization on either being neophilic or neophobic in birds. And one major study was done in Poland, where researchers placed hundreds of these feeding tables, both in rural environments and in urban environments. And for some of those feeding tables, they just put a weird object on top, something they put together themselves out of green putty, something that the birds definitely would never have seen before. And they simply counted how many individuals of the 3 most common bird species would visit bird feeding tables with or without this novel object. And it turned out that outside of the city, in the rural environments, birds tended to avoid feeding tables with this novel object on top. But in the city, it was exactly the other way around. Birds tended to approach more strongly feeding tables which had this weird thing on top. So it seems that indeed in cities, the personality of birds was to be more curious towards novel things. And with problem-solving ability, it's basically the same story. If you live in a stable natural environment, once you know how to open the nuts that you depend on as a bird, that's going to work for thousands of years. You don't come across novel problems all the time. But in cities, again, it's not like that. People are producing and packaging food in novel ways every few years. And to have high problem solving abilities is a good thing for an urban bird. It's something that probably would benefit it, because you can quickly inspect novel objects and quickly find out whether there's food inside or not, for example. Again, this has been studied a number of times in urban animals. And one nice study was done on the island of Barbados, where there is a field center of the University of Montreal. And the field center is on the beach, and next to the field center there are nightclubs and restaurants. So the students were spending a little bit more time outside of the field center than inside of the field center, and they needed a justification for that. So they came up with a nice research project to study the problem-solving abilities of the Barbados bullfinch, which they observed feeding on sugar packages on the tables of the restaurants. So they caught about 30 urban Barbados bullfinches and also 30 rural Barbados bullfinches, and presented them with puzzle boxes. So puzzle box is a contraption made by the researchers themselves, which requires several manipulations to get to the food inside, and they are objects that the birds had never seen before. So here you see an urban bullfinch approaching one of those puzzle boxes, and it quickly has figured out you have to pull out a drawer, and then there's a lid on top which can be pried off and also can be nicely put to one side, and then it gets to the food. And these of the urban bullfinches, they all could do this, and they all could do it very quickly within 1 minute, whereas the rural bullfinches, half of them couldn't do it at all, and the other half took much longer than the urban bullfinches to open these puzzle boxes. So again, an indication that there's higher problem solving ability. We don't know whether this is really evolutionary change, although we do know that problem solving ability does have a genetic component. So it's definitely something that could evolve. Now, of course, many of the examples I've given here are fairly subtle evolution. They're small changes in a single characteristic in a single species. We don't really see the evolution of completely novel urban species yet. Of course, we can't really expect that, because ants' nests have been around for millions of years, so there has been much more time for myrmecophiles to evolve than there has been for anthropophiles to evolve in cities. But still, there are a few cases of urban species that seem to have started on the way to become completely new species. And one of those is the urban blackbird in Europe. The blackbird is one of the first species that has colonized cities. And if you now look at urban blackbirds and compare them to forest blackbirds, you see not just a single change, but a whole list of characteristics in which these urban blackbirds have become different from their ancestors from the forest. The urban blackbirds have shorter beaks, They have a more highly high-pitched song. They sing at night, whereas the forest blackbirds don't do that. They start breeding much more early. They don't migrate anymore. So the urban blackbirds are non-migratory, whereas the forest blackbirds are migratory. They have a more relaxed personality, and that can be traced to a mutation in a gene for a serotonin receptor. Moreover, because the urban blackbirds start breeding before the rural blackbirds are back from the winter quarters, there's also a genetic barrier. By the time the urban blackbirds have produced their first clutch of eggs, the forest blackbirds are not yet back. So there are some conditions that may cause these two forms of the blackbird to eventually evolve into two separate species. But so yeah, that's still going to take a long time before we find the urban blackbird as a separate species in the bird guides, but it's not impossible. Now, of course, I'm quite excited about this whole phenomenon of urban evolution, particularly because it allows us. It happens so fast. It happens around us, and it allows us to observe evolution taking place in our own streets, in our own backyards, and that also makes it possible for this type of research to be done partly by citizen scientists. So we've started a number of projects here in the Netherlands where we involve citizen scientists in studying urban evolution. And one project we did over the past few years is to develop a smartphone app where people could take pictures of the garden snails, of which we know there's a genetic polymorphism. They come in many shell color forms ranging from very pale to very dark. And using this smartphone app, we've been able to show that in city centers, the proportion of very pale morphs is increased compared to rural environments, which we think may have to do with the urban heat island, because the pale colored shells reflect the sun's heat rays better than the darker ones, which prevents overheating of the snails in summer. So this could be an example of urban evolution, and we know that the shell color is completely genetic, of urban evolution adaptation to the urban heat island. Also, I think that this sense of that we are living in an urban environment that is constantly evolving, that the animals and plants that we share the urban environment with are evolving, will help us to design cities in which biodiversity thrives and in which we can make use of this process of urban evolution. So when we're talking about greening buildings, making green roofs and green walls, doing nature inclusive architecture, I think we should make use of the fact that the city is full of species that are in the process of becoming perfectly adapted urban species. So rather than planting species from a garden center catalog on those green buildings, we should just allow things to grow naturally, species that are already present in the city. So for example, there's a nice company here in the Netherlands that's developing pavement tiles which have a little hole in it, which allows weeds to grow in. So you have green pavements which still function as pavements, but at the same time they're also a habitat for small weeds that produce little patches of vegetation, or bee bricks, which are building elements produced in the UK, which already have holes in them for social bees, for solitary bees to build their nests in. So I think there are lots of ways in which we can make use of this phenomenon of urban evolution in urban green planning, and also in involving urban citizens in research and in biodiversity observation. With that, I'd like to end. This is a very nice animation of the cover of my book that my American publisher made, and of course in the book there are many more examples than what I've been able to give you in the past 50 minutes. And thank you very much for your attention wherever you are.
Fantastic. Thank you, Menno. That was great. It's been a long day here of bureaucratic nonsense. So it was very nice to, even though it's urban, it was nice to see some biology and remind myself what animals can do, and that evolution is going to carry on long after we have vanished.
Yes, it is. It is.
Yes, that was really great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So what we'll do now is we'll take questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, if you put your hand up, I can turn your microphone on and you can ask a question. And just as a little incentive, we've got Lachlan who's going to ask a question first. I'll turn you on in a second, Lachlan. But the first PhD student from ANU who chooses to ask a question, I will buy you a copy of Menno's book of Darwin Comes to Town. So the first one who chooses to ask a question can do so, can win that book. Great. I'm going to turn on the microphone, Lachlan, and let you ask your question.
Hi, Menno, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hi, Lachlan.
Love your talk. I wanted to know, actually, if you have any advice for scientists who are also interested in writing popular science and tips for that.
Well, yeah, the way I started, I started when I was a PhD student, just writing for the university newspaper. I think, yeah, it depends a bit whether you mean how to develop your style or how to find opportunities to write. I think that the latter is usually the more challenging, because your style, that can develop over time. So what I did actually, or what I found out when I started writing for a general public, was that newspapers and websites, they usually don't have easy access to the stories and the news that goes around in university. So if you're based in a university, you can be you're very good at scouting new ideas, new subjects that you could pitch to newspapers or to radio programs or websites. So what I would do is, at conferences or department talks, or just talking to colleagues or academics, build a list of subjects that people are working on, which could be easily translated as interesting stories for a general public, and pitch those to to a newspaper or to whoever you would like to write for, if you're talking about writing.
Yeah, sure. Oh, thanks very much. Thanks, Michael.
Okay. Good luck.
Next is Nick.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you, Nick. You might have to speak up a little bit.
Okay, sorry. Is this audible?
Yes.
Okay. I'm a PhD student from ANU, so I guess that fills the criteria.
Ah, well done. You just beat Tobias. I think Tobias might have thought he'd got it.
I put my question in the Q&A, so I'm not sure if you've already read it or not. But my question was regarding birds and moths and other animals that navigate by light, whether that is primarily by the sort of continuum light intensity, or whether that's a specific wavelength of light that they navigate by. I'm wondering specifically, I guess, whether we'd be able to filter out specific wavelengths that are confusing these animals, and whether that can assist in that way, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I'm not too sure about I'm sure it depends on the species. That some species are more sensitive to certain wavelengths and others to others. So actually, for a long time, when we were using sodium lights, for example, which have a very narrow wavelength bandwidth, probably the effects were more limited than nowadays, when we have broad spectrum lights at night, and even LED illumination, which covers the entire light spectrum. So at the moment, I think the use of LED lights is actually probably affecting more species than it was in the past, when we were using sodium or mercury or mixtures for lighting roads at night. But it's definitely something that we could explore to produce lights at night that that still function for whatever benefits we'd like to have from them, and at the same time minimize the effects on species, on other species.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
All right,
Yeah,
Nick.
no, good point. Thanks.
Send me an email, Nick, so that I know where to deliver the book once it arrives.
Awesome.
Oh,
Thanks.
all right. The next next person is Tobias.
Can you hear me?
We can,
Yep.
Tobias.
Great, thanks. That was a really interesting talk.
Thank you.
I think this idea of city ecosystems or evolution kind of continuing and creating this novel environment is a really, really interesting one. I guess I kind of feel like we're partly invested in the outcome of this. We want to preserve some kind of as much biodiversity as we can.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess I was wondering what you think about, the idea of just letting things go, letting species colonize, and the most city adapted ones kind of taking over there versus kind of trying to work towards certain goals or certain, conservation in urban environments or that kind of idea.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. That's also the point I'm trying to make at the end of my book. I mean, of course, we'd like, especially in cities, we'd like to try to manage, the urban environment. But urban evolution is probably so fast and so pervasive and takes place constantly with thousands of species in urban environments that there is an entire ecosystem that is in the process of evolving. There's no way we could try to manage that. So in fact, probably we should make use of that process simply by just offering the space for these species to settle. I mean, if you're building a new building, and if you want to do nature inclusive building, then try not to plant certain species on that building, or if you're making a green roof, you don't really need to pre-select plants to grow on that roof. You could simply just provide the soil, or maybe not even the soil, you could just simply provide the space for soil to accumulate in naturally, and simply let those communities settle and evolve and assemble naturally from this huge pool of partly evolved urban species.
Thanks.
Tobias, good news. I'm also going to buy you a book.
Thanks, Mike.
No one leaves empty-handed. Do we have another question? Okay, Nishant Kumar. You should be able to talk now, Nishant.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Hi. Yes.
Thanks, Mike. Hi, Menno.
Hi, Nishant.
Thanks for an interesting talk. But considering that I am from Global South, I'm speaking from Delhi now.
Yeah.
And I would like you to make few comments about the human culture and how it kind of fixes in connection with the animal cultures and vice versa. So it's an important aspect for urban ecology and evolution in the Global South.
Mm-hmm.
So it will be helpful for the listeners if you talk about it from your experience. Thank you.
Well, I think I'm not entirely sure what aspect of the human culture you're referring to, but one thing that I think is very interesting in urban biology, urban ecology, is that it is actually run. So this urban process of urban evolution is fueled by human culture, because we create those cities, we communicate with each other about how to create those cities, even globally. I mean, whenever a new, we're just talking about street lighting, if a new street lighting is invented somewhere across the world, it can, and it's a good invention, that it will spread through human communication to cities all over the world, whether they're in the north or in the south or in the west or in the east. within a few years, all the cities will be using this new invention, and all the urban communities of animals and plants will suddenly face a novel ecological condition that is put there by human long-distance communication, basically. So all those, this urban ecosystem is a global ecosystem that is homogenized by information transfer through human social networks, and at the same time physically also homogenized, because species are transported by humans from city to city. So even in India, you would have house crows, and you would have rats and houseflies, and there's a whole list of species that live in cities all over the world, even though they originate either in the north or in the south. But they probably have already adapted to the urban ecosystem to such an extent that they can live anywhere in the world. House sparrows are another example. So human culture, I think, is actually what is driving this whole process, and the non-human species become inextricably linked to human culture because their evolution is steered by it. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think in terms of human culture and urban biodiversity, I think that is one of the most fascinating aspects of the whole process.
Thank you.
I noticed, Menno, there was a paper, I think in Science last week, which was sort of talking about social justice and urban environments, and it perhaps made reference to the differences in biodiversity in richer versus poorer parts of a city, which I thought was, it seems like a very obvious pattern that one can observe, but I'd never really thought about it before as a topic of study for an ecologist.
Yeah, I also noticed that paper. Yeah, I mean, I haven't read it, but I noticed there were some tweets about it. It looked very interesting, and it there are some earlier studies also which show that the botanical diversity in cities is depending partly on the average income of a certain environment, and that not just in gardens but also outside of gardens, which probably are the result of richer people investing more money in the plants that they put in their garden, which then escape into the environment.
Yeah, that was one thing I think I remember from your book, is like a reminder of how much diversity I mean, you've talked about cities more, but I guess cities include the suburbs around them. How much diversity there is in the suburbs of plant life, for example. An area that might have comparatively few, relatively few plants like Canberra, suddenly, there's roses and tulips and daffodils and so many different things.
We tend to exclude those because they're not native, but of course the rest of the environment doesn't exclude them. To them, they're just a food source and species to start interacting with. So yes, these exotic plants that are planted in gardens are exposed to the native insects and the native worms and the native animals and plants that are already there. So yes, we are creating a richer, more diverse ecosystem simply by planting stuff.
We have a question from Rocco. I'll read it out because Rocco hasn't put his hand up. So, do you have evidence that the differences between rural and urban individuals are genetic, or that they might be plastic responses? So I guess the real question here is, to what extent do we know whether these are evolved responses versus plasticity?
Yeah. Well, in some cases, of course, they've been tested with common garden experiments. So you can at least say many of the examples that have given in this talk, or that I give in my book, such experiments have been done, but certainly not in all cases. So, but even if they have been done, so if we know that they're heritable, they could still be epigenetic, and there's some idea that epigenetic changes may actually be very important in these rapid evolution, or these rapid changes in heritable features in urban versus non-urban populations of the same species. So that is something that is only starting to be investigated now, and I think there's a few cases already, surprisingly also in Darwin's finches on the Galapagos, which are also urban birds nowadays. where these epigenetic changes play an important role. So I definitely think that there's probably a whole mixture of plasticity and so let's say from full plasticity to full genetic changes that are playing a role in the adaptation in these things. Of course, you could think of plasticity or epigenetic changes as a sort of rapid response to a change in conditions, which could then be consolidated by sort of more traditional microevolution.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone else have a question they would like to ask? I'm aware that Menno must be dying for a cup of coffee.
Well, I've got one here, so.
All right. Okay, I don't see anyone else putting their hand up. So, oh, here, we've got Luis.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Yes. Good. Thanks. Very good talk. Thank you very much. I was wondering what types of changes in the city environment could be done to reduce or get rid of unwanted pest species like roaches or rats or disease-carrying pigeons?
Well, I think one important change would be for people to be somehow conditioned not to consider things as pests that aren't pests. I think that probably would help a lot already. Of course, this what we define as a pest is partly what we experience as a pest, and there are many species that people say are pests, but they're not actually doing any harm. We just tend to, maybe not we biologists, but the average urbanite would experience them if they reach a certain high density as a pest, even though they're not actually harming. But yes, of course, there are species which, like you say, are causing diseases or physically competing with our food. Probably, well, my gut feeling would be the more species rich the urban environment is, the fewer species would likely develop into pests. So I think as a general rule, that would probably help if you can produce more biodiverse, more balanced ecosystems in cities. Then probably fewer species can develop into pests. That's probably one thing to do. Otherwise, yeah, I guess it's probably hard to avoid. You will have, if you have an urban ecosystem and you have a high density of people and a high density of resources that those people bring, you will have species that are competing with us for those resources. And in some cities that doesn't go much further than rodents or mice, but yeah, we just had somebody from Delhi, and of course you can also get leopards and crocodiles in your city. So it's yeah, this human wildlife conflict is probably something that is very hard to avoid completely in cities.
All right. Thanks, Menno. Do we have any more questions? Okay, I think we should let you off the hook. I look forward to the day when Australian magpies, by whether it's by plasticity or adaptation, learn to calm down and stop attacking people, because it's the time of year where the magpies are starting to go crazy in Australia.
Oh yeah. Oh, I love them. Yeah. But that's from distance, of course.
Yeah, they are very impressive, but they are kind of scary. Look, Menno, that was fantastic. I really enjoyed that talk, and I can see from the comments that a lot of other people did as well. And I think it's if nothing else, it's a fantastic reminder of like different ways you could teach about evolution and connect with people that maybe grown up in cities and don't really have much experience with wild areas, and bring them into the fold of thinking about biology and appreciating
I think
the marvels of evolution. So it's really wonderful. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for organizing it.
And before you go, are you okay with us posting the recording? Because I realized I didn't ask you at the beginning.
Yes, I think I am, yes.
Okay, if you change your mind, please let me know and we'll remove
Sure.
it. Otherwise, I know that colleagues who couldn't be here today will look forward to attending. All right.
Yeah, no problem.
Thanks, everyone. And we will see you around. And thanks, Menno.
Okay, thanks very much for having
All right.
me.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye,
Good
Menno.
day.
Thanks.